Thank you so much, Director Min, for including me in this extremely important conversation today here at Queens College. It is an honor to be here, and I also applaud your remarks. We are here to speak on behalf of the Lions, and they did come forward to tell the truth. So we have the responsibility not to own their history, but to interpret it for the present and for the future. And I am honored to be part of this. This is not about Japan bashing. This is not Japan's history. This is a history of humanity, and we all have a right to this history. So this is not an us versus them approach, and that's what I'd like to speak about today, because now more than ever, we recognize the need to broaden the discussion of the history of Japan's militarized, state-sponsored sexual slavery. And I've got just a few slides to demonstrate why. In rough terms, I'm discussing the denialist approach. You could also call them the fake news approach. The group that would collectively denigrate, distort, and deny the history that we know to have happened. The problem with their approach is clear. It denigrates the survivors of the history that is a crime against humanity. Its strategy can sometimes be less clear, however, when it turns into Japan versus another country, a contest that overpowers any historical contextualization. In the case of the Halmoni, despite the fact that the surviving women, as we know, came from throughout the empire, most often this is reduced to Japan versus Korea. This image in particular is one of the denialists' favorite to use. With it, they argue that the Japanese state did not perpetrate the system of sexual slavery that it did. The picture was taken in Okinawa by an American soldier in June 1945, towards the end of the battle there, a battle known in Japanese as the Typhoon of Steel, which witnessed the bloodiest fighting in the Pacific Theater in World War II. There in Okinawa, at that horrible battle, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army sacrificed Okinawan islanders and their land in order to slow the progress of the Allied troops' invasion of the Japanese mainland. Also, it was the battle where Japan essentially lost everything it had that might have helped defend the mainland. I say this up front because in terms of centrist Japanese collective war memory, this battle represents utter defeat to most Japanese and remains something extremely disturbing, the treatment of Okinawans in Okinawa as less than Japan and Japanese. Woven into this phenomenon, those in Japan who would deny the history of the Halmoni often rely on this particular photograph from that general moment in time to explain that the Japanese were not so bad after all. What do I mean? This picture appears in countless deniers' books, websites, and the caption on this particular one makes clear the larger aim. An American soldier is procuring a Korean girl whom the caption insinuates with no evidence, but could be correct, that the Korean man in the background had sold the girl to the American. Whatever the truth is becomes irrelevant because the caption plays on well-known stereotypes as well as documented evidence to generate a broadly felt understanding that because the Korean man sold the Korean girl to the American, the history of Japanese state-sponsored sexual slavery did not happen. Let me put it another way. The caption's author, like countless others who use this logic, relies on a widespread misperception in Japanese society that Koreans are liars or cheaters. Since there is no Japanese man in the picture, the logic goes, then it is not Japan's fault. Besides, the logic further extends that we know that Americans used some of the girls and women to make their own state-backed comfort stations after the war, so it is really the Americans who should be blamed. After all, there is no Japanese in the photo. Pictures like this regularly appear in books with titles such as The Truth of the Comfort Women, or Korea Must Tell the Truth, and so on. Again, evidence and fact are not the point in the denialist approach because these narratives collectively seek to portray the Japanese male as honorable, unlike the Korean or American alternative, and therefore Japan itself collectively could not have committed the heinous crime. Now, this approach is disgusting on a number of levels. First and foremost, in cases where the person who procured the victim was Korean, in no way does this lessen the horror of Japan's state-sponsored system in terms of what happened to those trapped within it. Moreover, the denialist approach has nothing to do with history, let alone human rights, and first and foremost, it denies Japanese history. Despite the denialist assertion that there are no official documents, at this stage, collectively, thanks to the efforts of many of the people in this room, we have at least 500, beginning with the well-known materials from Japanese government documents following the Nanjing massacre in December 1937. Together, these make clear that the Halmonese history resulted from a systemic, state-planned, state-organized, and state-sponsored effort. And the reason to keep repeating the term state-sponsored is that some crimes, war crimes and crimes against humanity, occur on such a widespread scale and over such a period of time that they can happen only with state backing and state sanction. Moreover, because certain crimes result from state organization, the inheritor state of the perpetrator regime bears responsibility for the crime's restitution, unless the predecessor has been completely annihilated in legal terms. In the case of contemporary Japan, wartime Japan is not negated in any legal sense. First, the 1947 Constitution inherited its predecessor state. That is, the 1947 Constitution, the Constitution of Japan today, is not an abnegation, a denial of the state that preceded it, but rather it is legally defined as an amendment to the 1889 Constitution. A second, the 1951 Allied Peace Treaty with Japan, known generally as the San Francisco Treaty, went into force in April 1952 only because the government of Japan fully agreed to the terms of surrender and responsibility that came with it. So let me begin this exciting day by refreshing our memories. I'm lead batter here, and you all know these documents, but I think it's important to begin, as mentioned, with defining terms. So let me begin with a 1938 Japanese government document that we all know well. Again, we have more than 500 of these pieces of paper, regardless what the Japanese government said. Among them is the March 4th, 1938 War Ministry's Adjutant Notification. The March 1938 notice, known to us as the recruitment memo, says that the troops dispatched to China, the North China Area Army and the Central China Expeditionary Army, must become stricter in selecting contractors and must work closely with local civilian and military police when recruiting women. For some contractors selected by those troops used abduction-like methods within Japan proper while getting the so-called comfort women for them. Let me read from the standard English translation of the notice from the Adjutant Chiefs of Staff of the North China Area Army. Quote, "In recruiting women domestically, meaning Japan, to work in the military comfort stations to be set up, this is before, in the areas affected by the China incident, it is feared that some people have claimed to be acting with the military's consent and have damaged the honor of the Army, inviting the general misunderstanding of the public. We are also afraid that, through the mediation of reporters following the military and the people visiting soldiers, people are recruiting women unsupervised and causing social problems. There have been instances where a lack of proper consideration resulted in the selection of inappropriate people to round up the women. People kidnap women and are arrested by the police. There are many things that require careful attention. In the future, armies of the field will control the recruiting of women and will use scrupulous care in selecting people to carry out this task." So back to this photograph, which denies Japanese involvement in the procurement of women and girls and boys into the system, this brings us to the question of agency, something also that an international human rights approach helps with, and something that the denialists would avoid entirely. As an occupied place, as Korea was from 1905 to 1945, or you can push it back even further, as an occupied place, the notion that Koreans, among others under Japanese control, could refuse orders from the Imperial Japanese military is simply fallacy. So when ordered to round up victims for the system, many did, And we know this, and even knowing this does not mean, as the denialists would have it, that the history didn't happen. And we can know this beginning with the recruitment memo, which is not even discussing how the system procured victims in Korea or elsewhere, rather addressing the practices already happening within Japan, something that was already causing social problems in the spring of 1938. So the denialists that we are up against clearly show no interest in learning from the evidence already collected. They deny Japanese history in the past, and worse, they deny Japanese citizens' rights to this history today. I took this picture at one of the Wednesday demonstrations last May. In many ways, history is a human right, and to possess the ability to claim one's own history, whether it is something to take pride in or to feel terrible about, accords a basic human dignity. This picture shows 3 women from Japan who came under their own, they self-financed their trip to Seoul late last May to attend a Wednesday demonstration. They had made their sign themselves, and they were carefully studying Korean in their various hometowns in Japan. And what's interesting is the choice of verb forms. For those who read this, they are saying that the Japan-Korea Accord of December 2015 is not a resolution, it doesn't solve the problem, and that together they are going to work, both Koreans and Japanese together, to bring peace and human rights to the Halmani together, all with themselves. And what's interesting is that they know that they're as much part of this, and again, not an us versus them approach. So it's at this juncture that we can understand how this steers us towards recognition of the past for reconciliation now and prevention of similar atrocity in the future. Because the other thing that happened last May was truly the astonishing this event taking place in Berlin, where a Chinese women's group, together with a Korean women's group and a German human rights advocates group, made possible for Halmani Gi-won-ok to travel from Korea to meet with a survivor of an ISIS sex slave operation. To me, no better moment underscores what this international human rights approach can enable for the victims themselves, and how it enables all of us who study this history and learn from it why we're doing it, to recognize the true nature of never again. Now, obviously, it is not enough simply to say never again, but one of the most promising developments enabled by a human rights approach is awareness of the centrality of the survivors and victims to achieving reconciliation. And I'm putting this up, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these wonderful maps I shouldn't say wonderful, these plot charts of where the camps were stationed throughout the empire. Obviously, this is research still in motion, and many of you in the room are actually responsible for this astonishingly helpful project. Because in seeking justice and affirmation of the truth of this history, the Halmani from throughout the area of Japan's former empire have collectively worked together to raise global awareness about rape and targeted sexual violence during wartime. Together, they have brought about changes to international measurements for what constitutes affronts to the dignity of a person, as well as broadened understanding of criminal acts, especially against women and girls. That these practices unfortunately endure in places of open conflict, such as ISIS and Boko Haram, means that we have to work harder to gain recognition for the history of systemized sexual violence under Japanese areas of occupation in the 1930s and 40s, which is that large swath extending all the way to, halfway across the Pacific and back through the Asian mainland. Why bother with the past? To learn how states organize their apparatuses to bring about such acts of criminality. And in this vein, I will refer in closing here to another well-known 1938 Japanese government document. Despite the fact that the current Osaka city government is threatening to cut its sister ties with San Francisco because of the recent unveiling of a really broad-minded new statute claiming that there are no records of forced relocation, we have among our archives the February 1938 Japanese Home Ministry Matters Concerning Women Traveling to China. And again, let me read from from the official translation to this, because it's important to really recognize that several prominent Japanese academics, non-denialists, who then run into the problem of themselves being targeted and defined as non-Japanese or anti-Japanese simply for doing their history research. Several of them, such as Professor Nagai Kazu of Kyoto University, maintain that the recruitment memo mentioned earlier, the one I read from earlier, gave military backing to this prior Home Ministry order, which came about a month earlier. Let me read from it. The 1938 Home Ministry document was in regards to the dispatch to Tokyo of a staff officer from the 21st Army. This officer, accompanied by a section chief of the Ministry of War, made a request to the Police Bureau of the Home Ministry that women be recruited. The Police Bureau, in the name of the Chief of the Bureau, ordered prefectural governors to select appropriate officials to handle the recruitment process and to provide assistance. The Office of the Army General Staff itself was also deeply involved in this operation. These tasks were the responsibility of the police, thus the orders came down from the governor to the Chief of the Police Bureau and then to chiefs of the police stations who mobilized a number of police officers. In other words, the recruitment and transfer of the women was systematically organized not only by expeditionary forces of the Office of the Army Staff in Tokyo, but it also involved the entire administrative machinery of the state. All levels of administrative structure, central as well as local, were involved in these operations. To understand the Halmanese history, we need to learn from multiple sources in multiple languages that yield evidence with which to teach, affirm, complicate, and enrich the international history that happened. To best approach a way forward, we need to consider its scope as a human rights atrocity on a global scale. Doing so makes clear to the surviving victims and the inheritor state that perpetrated the crime that this is not about one country versus another. Rather, it is about achieving dignity for those who suffered, as well as making clear to the world an international commitment to prevent its occurrence in the future. Thank you.